Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 Economic Forecast sponsored by CaroMont Health and First Horizon Bank. We're so glad you're here. I'm Steve with the GBA, and we're ready to be educated, learn some things, and enjoy some fellowship on this absolutely beautiful day. This event offers our GBA investors exclusive insights into the economic landscape ahead, arming us with the knowledge to make informed strategic decisions. We consider this an event a cornerstone of our commitment, our GBA investors. As economic trends continue to shift, staying ahead of what's coming in the new year is critical. If you want to recognize a few folks here, if you are a GBA board member, could you please stand? Thank you for your service, our GBA board members. And how about our current and newly elected officials in the room? Any current or newly elected officials in the room? And that includes two of our three newest mayors in Gaston County. So Mayor Strapp from Cherville and Mayor Washam from McAdenville. So we're so glad you guys are here and taking this back to your respective towns. In addition, I would be remiss if I did not announce a recent honoree. Many folks in the county didn't even know this was going to happen, but just recently, Donnie Hicks, our EDC director, received the North Carolina EDA Lifetime Achievement Award. Our presenting sponsor, CaroMont Health, is a true champion of business. As one, if not the largest employer in Gaston County, CaroMont Health has long been a cornerstone of our community, not only as a trusted healthcare provider, but as an economic driver and committed community partner. CaroMont's support this year of its economic forecast reflects the belief that a healthy economy and a healthy community go hand in hand. The GBA is deeply grateful for their ongoing partnership and for all they do to help our region thrive. Thank you, CaroMont. We'd also like to extend our sincere thanks to First Horizon, the economist sponsor again for this year's event. Their partnership made it possible to bring today's featured economist, Sophia Carney-Letterman, to Gaston County to share valuable insights and trends shaping our regional and national economy. She left New York City last week. She's coming back to a different New York City and has gotten to spend all her time this week going around North Carolina and sharing her thoughts. So also now, join me in thanking our table sponsors for today's events, Choice Beverage, Watson Insurance, and Enbridge Gas. I would now like to introduce Chris Williams, Senior Vice President at First Horizon and Charlotte's commercial team, to lead us and introduce our economists. Chris.
I'm Chris Williams with First Horizon Bank, and it's a pleasure, my pleasure to welcome you and again to be here for this year's Economic Forecast event. We're proud to support this event again this year. It's always a valuable opportunity to come together, share insights, look ahead at what's shaping our economy and our communities. For those of you that are not familiar with First Horizon, we're an $82 billion asset bank, financial institution with more than 7,200 associates and 416 branches throughout our footprint. You may have seen some of our advertisements. There's one on 85 out here I saw driving in. It talks about our brand promise, big bank muscle and small bank hustle. It reflects who we are. We bring strength, resources, and stability of a large financial institution paired with the agility, personal attention, and dedication that you expect from a local partner. It's not just a slogan, it's how we do business. As we look ahead, it's important to understand the trends shaping growth and the overall direction of our economy. To help us do that today, we have Sophia with us. Sophia is the senior economist at FHN Financial. She provides regular economic updates and presentations for First Horizon Bank, the parent company of FHN Financial. As senior economist, she integrates macroeconomic views and interest rate forecasts with her own economic analysis of regional markets and specific industries. She served as the senior business analyst, global commercial services with American Express. That's a mouthful. Did you have that on a card or?
They change acronyms like every week.
Okay, all right. That was from 2017 to 2020. And prior to that tenure at Amex, Sophia trained as an economic analyst with FHN Financial for 3 years. Sophia graduated magna cum laude from Washington and Lee University with a BA in economics and Spanish, and she welcomes any Spanish questions. She's a member of the Phi Beta Kappa and Omicron Delta Epsilon. Sophia was born, raised, and currently lives in New York City. So welcome, Sophia.
Thank you. Having my bio read to me is my least favorite part of the whole day. I think I'm just going to rewrite it and go, this is just Sophia, like Cher. Except, I'm not going to sing. But Cher and I do have the same birthday, so I feel like we're basically the same. Thank you all, Chris, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming out, excuse me, early in the morning to hear about the economy. And thank you to the GBA for having me again. I think, is this my third or fourth, maybe, year in a row? And I was just talking, it seems like every year we have a lot more questions than answers. Oops, I went the wrong way. And so what are we looking at in the economy right now? I joke that if you've been here before, I love data, I love slides, but this year, we're missing a lot of data, so I just have 20 blank pages. That is, of course, a joke. I have several slides with more than one chart on them because I'm going to give you probably more than you want to hear at 8:08 in the morning. But there's a lot to cover with what's going on in the economy. And so, what are we looking at right now? Well, as you can see, we have mixed signals. We have things in every direction. Oh, too soon. Oh, wow, this clicker is sensitive. We have missing data. We have not gotten any government data except for one data report, the CPI, since the government shut down October 1st. So we are relying on a lot of private sector data. And then we also have a Fed that is easing right now. They've cut twice this year, September and October, but they're navigating towards neutral, that elusive rate where things are neither expansive or restrictive for monetary policy. And there are some that think that they might be there, other thinks that there's more to go. And so while we're in the process of easing, there's a lot of different opinions. And as Powell said last week, missing data and mixed signals also makes it foggy, right? They're driving through the fog right now. So what is the biggest mixed signal that we've had, or sort of surprise that we've seen? Well, this year there has been no shortage of uncertainty. 2025, the word of the year is absolutely, I think, going to be uncertainty. It's gotten so normalized that I've started to say that uncertainty might be the new certainty, right? The new normal is that we're not really sure what's going on. What has been the biggest uncertainty this year? Anyone want to guess? Starts with a T. Tariffs. No, not transitory. That's from years past. Tariffs have been the biggest uncertainty this year. What has also been surprising, though, has been the resilience of the economy after the first half of this year, right? That we've actually seen economic growth, which you have here, your GDP, has been much stronger than most of us were worried about at the end of the first quarter, beginning of the second quarter. So what have we really seen? This is your real GDP. I pretty much always start with this because it's the basic measure of the output in the economy. Real means it's inflation adjusted, which takes into account price changes. It's your stacked bar contribution. So if you took Econ 101, either recently or many years ago, it is your C plus I plus NX plus G. How do we get to the output in the economy? Pretty tight time period here, 23, 24, the 2 quarters we have of 25, and then forecast for the third and fourth quarter. We should have third quarter GDP, but we don't because it's been delayed by the government shutdown. Now, before we talk about what we've seen this year, I do want a quick reminder of last year. I did go back and look at my slides from last year. I hope no one else did because We don't need to know if I was right or wrong. But this time last year, we were kind of also in a slightly uncertain period, right? In 2024, there was a good amount of uncertainty as well. And what were the big uncertainties? Well, one was similar to this year. We were waiting for the Fed to cut interest rates until September of 2024, right? We've been all year, they said we're ready to ease, but we didn't get it till September. And then the other really big one was who was going to be in the White House, right? We didn't know that until I actually think I was here the day after the election last year. And so we had these two uncertainties in 24. Once we knew those, the Fed was easing, we knew that Trump was coming in, there was this expectation that the growth we'd seen in 24 was going to continue and maybe even pick up, right? That was the sort of expectation. And a lot of that was based on modeling Trump's second term based on his first, where the sort of good things that were pro-growth, think tax changes and deregulation came in the first half, and the bad things like tariffs came in the second half, right? We had them in 2018 in the first term. But pretty much early on in the first quarter, we knew that that was actually probably going to be the flip-flop because tariffs were the first thing on the agenda. And so you actually saw evidence of how tariffs impacted growth immediately in the first quarter, and it wasn't just the tariffs themselves because they weren't announced until April, it was the expectation. So what happened? What was the big drag? We had negative growth in the first quarter. The really big drag was net exports. Firms imported a ton of things ahead of tariffs, right? People tried to front run the expectation of tariffs, and even before we knew what any of the tariff rates were. So we brought in a lot of stuff, we imported more than we exported, which is a negative to our growth. It went into inventories, which is the gray, which makes sense. And then what happened in the second quarter after tariffs, the absolute flip-flop, right? Imports came to not fully a stop. For some countries like China, they did temporarily, but imports slowed down because of tariffs, right? You saw some inventory drawdown. But we also saw some pickup in consumer spending in the second quarter. And then when we look at the third quarter, we're tracking 3.9% growth. We follow something called the Atlanta Fed GDP Now, which is a live updated nowcast model, which means as data comes out, it is updated. It ended at 3.9%. We should have gotten the official data last week. We didn't. They tend to be pretty close. So that's pretty strong growth, right? And consistent after the second quarter, again, because that rebound in the second quarter we thought was just a rebound. But we've actually seen an economy that's continued to grow. Our expectation for the fourth quarter is around the same level. However, you will notice that consumer spending, we have a little bit of a hit to, and it's a little bit of a hit to business fixed. Some of that, particularly in consumer spending, is expectations that the government shutdown is going to take away from GDP growth. We expect to see that, particularly we're on day 37, the longest shutdown in history. What tends to happen in government shutdowns, because we do have previous examples, is it's a hit to growth in the quarter that it happens, and then we see a rebound. So we could see it pick back up in the first quarter. But by and large, the big thing is, as we sit here, and as the Fed sits here, is that growth has been remarkably resilient this year, right? The expectation was that things might be kind of bad. And what's been the big driver? Well, part of it is that consumer spending has rebounded, and we're going to talk in a lot of detail about that in a couple slides, because the way the consumer spends is the way this economy grows. It's 70% of GDP, which is why I have consumer spending here as well. But the other really big driver, and what's very different about this year versus previous years, is that a lot of it's coming from AI and technology investment, right? You can probably not open up the news, turn on the TV, read Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, without hearing the words AI these days. Chris was just telling me in Glila has the .ai, the island, they own it. Great for them, right? AI is everywhere right now. And it's literally everywhere when we look at sort of where the investment has been. And so this has been a big driver of this almost 4% growth. So what do we have here? Again, you have personal consumption, which is that 70% of the US economy. And then two categories of business fixed investment. So if we think about that previous slide, this is sort of broken out. Software and then information processing equipment. Now obviously both of these are not directly called AI, but they're two critical components, right? You'll notice that in the first quarter, equipment was a big investment. What was that? Tariff front running, right? That was exactly that, trying to get in ahead of particularly tariffs on things like Chinese goods. Software, though, has continued to be a big contributor as well in the second quarter. And this is really all you hear about, right? It's part of what's fueling growth in the stock market as well. And it really is what's driving the momentum. The tough thing for the Fed is that we're having this 4% growth and we're going to see this mixed signal of strong growth, but a labor market that's kind of stalled, right? because businesses are electing to invest in this technology, a lot of which requires less people, right? A lot of which requires, or which sort of downsizes the workforce that's needed. And so we have this very interesting picture for the Fed where some people are worried about this 4% growth and other people are worried about what it means for the labor market. I think we're going to continue to see this investment grow into 2026. A really big question becomes also though, when does it start to be productive output as well, not just investment? The other thing I will call out, it's not included here, there's also a ton of investment in data centers, right? Another thing you can't pretty much open the news and read not about it. That's definitely happening across the country. It's happening in a lot of small towns. I was reading a great article this week in the Journal about a town in Oregon, and it has a ton of ripple effects in those communities, but also has people asking the questions, okay, what happens after the data center is built, right? Does it become continuous employment or is it sort of a one-time boom? And so we're sitting in this is this difficult for the Fed to navigate period. I want to talk about consumer spending now in a little bit more detail. Because again, the way the consumer spends is the way this economy grows, right? And right now in particular, we have a lot of interesting things happening with consumption and there are mixed signals for the consumer as well. So to start out talking about the biggest piece of when we think about consumers, what is it? Housing. Housing is a really critical point. I live in New York City, it's obviously been a big thing of discussion for us recently. It's funny too, obviously I'm invested in who's the mayor. It's funny, like, wow, everyone really cares about us this week. It's nice. But I will say, don't use New York as a good example of a housing market because we're not a good one. So what's going on in the housing market? Well, the housing market, like everything the last 5 years, hasn't operated the way we expected and continues not to. The really big thing in housing right now continues to be affordability, right? That is what has pretty much continued to plague the housing market and ground it almost to a full halt. So what have we seen? This is the most charts you will get on the slide. Don't worry, just 4. And what do we have here? So let's start off by looking at new and existing home sales growth year over year. So new being where you have the opportunity to create new homes for the market, existing being the bulk of the housing market, right? That's where most of the inventory is. Both of those have been bouncing around 0 since 2024. Right? We had that surge in pandemic demand. It was people running out of getting houses, people relocating from places like New York to North Carolina or California to Florida, right? You had that whole shift, surge. You also had mortgage rates that were really low that fueled that. We've been pretty flat for the last 2.5 years. Why? Well, part of it is because if we look on the other side, the Zillow Home Price and Rent Index, what happened when you had that surge in demand was there wasn't enough supply immediately because, look at privately owned units under construction. You see why they all have to be on the same side. The purple charts, we didn't see construction take off until we already had the demand there. If any of you are in construction, you know, it takes more than a month or 2 to build a house, right, or to build a building, and so there's a lag. So we didn't see new inventory come, and so we had this sort of lock in the housing market. What we've seen since we've seen sales slow is we're not seeing as much home price appreciation, but we're also not seeing prices come down, right? And so that big gain that we have nationally up a little bit above 30% since 2019, right? And in other markets, certain markets, Charlotte is close to it. If you look at that lighter blue line we have there, you've actually seen a little bit more appreciation than that. And so even though you don't have that continual price gain, because you have mortgage rates that are still high, you really have an affordability issue. You do have some new inventory that has come to certain markets, right? You can see how rental rates aren't rising as much necessarily everywhere. But the biggest issue is that you also have people locked out of the housing market. It also is partially mortgage rate lock. If anyone has a 2.5%, 3% mortgage in this room, are you interested in a 6.5% mortgage? What, a 7? Sound better? No, right? People aren't moving. And so you have this bulk of housing inventory that's just not moving. So everyone always asks me, right, a lot of people ask me about, their kids, people entering the housing market, when's it gonna shift? And I think the really tough thing is it's not until mortgage rates probably come down to that 5% level. And I think we have a little bit of time even with the Fed easing because there's pressure on the long end of the curve. I will say, I was just reading this morning, there was an article about because there's been that new inventory build and you haven't seen people buying them, you're starting to see some concessions from builders, right? Offering to sort of pay down some of the mortgage because the market is so stuck. that could help to start move things. But I think the biggest thing is going to be for consumers that with everything that's expensive, it's part of the thing that is sort of keeping a large portion of the consumer base sort of frozen, right? They're concerned about a lot of things, the labor market and inflation being the two biggest ones, that right now they're not jumping in to make a purchase like a home. And so that brings me to sort of where we also are with how consumers feel right now. There are sort of two different economies happening right now, high income and lower and middle income consumers, and they feel quite differently. Chart on the left here is the distribution of wealth by income percentile. The dark blue is the top 20% of income, lighter blue is the middle 40, and then the red is the bottom 40%. The top percentage has seen a pretty strong growth in their wealth, right? Why is that? Well, one, they tend to be homeowners, and you've seen that asset appreciation, and two, they tend to be invested in the stock market, which has done quite well. The top 20% own 70% of the wealth in the US currently. And in the second quarter, they accounted for 50% of consumer spending. That used to be around 35%, right? And so we're seeing higher income individuals fuel a lot of the spending, and you can see that they feel better as well, right? On the other side, you have the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index broken out by top, middle, and bottom. The percentages you'll notice don't match exactly, but they trend in the right direction, right? A couple of things to note about sentiment. One, across the board, no one feels as good as they did pre-pandemic, right? High income, low income, middle income. Why is that? It's because largely inflation is a burden to everyone. And then this year, you'll notice that no one was immune to the uncertainty of April and May, right? That really weighed on everyone in how they felt. But since then, we've seen higher income individuals starting to feel a little bit better, right? That dark blue line has risen. The other really big shift that we've seen since pre-pandemic, and particularly also that we've seen in the last year, and we're seeing a little bit more of a trend of this year, might be hard to see, but that light blue line is the middle 33%. The middle is now feeling more like the lower than they are the upper. Pre-pandemic, middle looked more like the upper, right? They felt a little bit better, but now that's not what they're feeling. And that is a little bit of a seatbelt on growth, right? Because you have consumer spending that's really being fueled by the top 20%, and it means that you have to continue to see assets remain appreciating and also continue to see stock market performance, right? So it's a little bit of a seatbelt. And what's driving a lot of this sort of divergence in sentiment and how people are spending and sort of the conscious consumerism that we have from the lower and middle? Well, a lot of it is inflation. Right? Inflation has been the biggest wild card for the last 2 years, but it's also been a really big wild card this year. The Fed came into 2025 expecting to ease. They had already cut in September of last year, October, and December, and the anticipation was they would continue to ease this year. They didn't because they were really worried about tariff-driven inflation, right? After we had the tariff announcement on April 2nd, the Fed basically was like, ooh, we're a little worried inflation's gonna skyrocket. And to be fair, most economists also, we were all worried about that. And why is that? Well, a tariff is essentially a tax. You're going to hear a lot about that. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments right now, and you'll hear that discussion going on. But it's a one-time price level reset, right? And so a lot of us, the way we looked at tariffs and the way we were thinking about it was, okay, well, they've been implemented. It's going to be a one-time jump for everyone immediately, and inflation could take off. We haven't actually seen that. Inflation actually hasn't been as bad as we were worried it was going to be this year. But we also haven't seen inflation moving towards 2% anymore, right? And so on one hand, it hasn't been as bad, but on the other hand, classic economists, both hands, we're also seeing some inflationary tariff-related pressure. So what do you have here? Also a busy slide, but this is the only inflation slide. On your left-hand side, you have per capita disposable income in both of these charts. That is your income after taxes. The top chart for everything is the year-over-year change in September of this year versus the year-over-year change in September of last year. So a measure of, relative to a year ago, are we seeing prices grow faster or slower? The bottom chart is, in the 5 years pre-pandemic, what did we see? And in the 5 years since 2019, what have we seen? Both charts, CPI is your consumer price index, which is a consumer measure of inflation. That is the only September data we have. Why did we get that? Well, you have to have the September CPI to do the Social Security cost of living adjustment. So the BLS called back a skeleton crew, and we had one data report. They do not expect to give us the next one. So we're going to be in this sort of data void is there. Inflation is also the only series where we really don't have private sector data. We're going to look at some of the employment data we do. This one we really don't. That's a lot of noise. Anyways, you have CPI, and then you have, think of that basket of goods, sort of the main goods you need, right? Food, you can either eat out at a restaurant, buy groceries. Housing, owner's equivalent rent. New and used cars, motor vehicle insurance. Daycare and preschool, which is a pretty essential spend for a lot of people. Energy goods, energy services. Okay, so that's all what's going on the side. We're all good? It's a lot. Yeah, I see some head nodding. Okay. All right, so what does it tell us? What have we seen? Let's start with the year-over-year change, right? Wage growth has slowed. Income growth has slowed, right? We're going to look at the next slide. Labor market slowed, right? You're not seeing as much income gain. So we were at 4.2 this time last year. Now we're at 3.5%. That is still growing a little bit faster than inflation, so that is some real wage growth, right? And again, this is sort of an average. Inflation has moved in the other direction, though. It was 2.4% last year, it's now 3%. Now again, that 3% is not as bad as we were projecting. There were forecasts calling for inflation to be as high as 8% by the end of this year. That was a little extreme. I think we at our peak had like 3.5. So it's not as bad, but it has still moved away from the Fed's 2% target. And then when we look at some category of goods, you can see how there are also mixed signals, right? Housing, we just talked about, not seeing as much appreciation. Owner's equivalent rent, 3.6% versus 5.2%. So an improvement, and that's a big one because that's the biggest chunk of consumer budgets, right? It has the most weight. So that's a good thing. But then think about food, right? Food at home and food away from home. Food away from home, which is restaurant spend, pretty much the same actually. Why is that? Well, because consumers have pulled back on restaurant spend, right? High income consumers have not, but lower and middle have. So quick service consumption of food has pulled back, and so there's not as much price pressure pass along there. Consumers aren't willing to take it. But grocery prices are up. Some of that's tariff related. Has anyone bought a coffee recently and been shocked at how expensive it was? 50% Brazil import had an impact on that. Also, they had a bad harvest, so that's sort of a double whammy. Same thing with beef. 50% Brazil import has had an impact on beef prices, but also we have very low cattle inventory in the US. That's a factor as well. So you have some of these pressures. New and used cars is another one I want to call out. We've actually surprisingly seen some strength in auto sales, but it's, again, higher income consumers. I was talking to someone who works in autos and he said, I'm shocked at how good my sales have been, and at the same time, my auto repair business, best year. Well, why is that? It's because higher income people are buying, lower income people are driving their cars longer and getting them serviced. And I thought that was a prime example. And the really big thing when we think about this sort of year-over-year inflation, that's not what people experience though. And it's something Pal talked to. And so this is why, the cumulative is why you have people feeling not great right now, particularly in the middle and low income. Because yeah, wages are up 36% in the last year, but vehicle insurance is up 56%. And your house price is up 31%. And your energy services, which think that's all your housing utilities, are up 39%, right? And when you think about lower and middle income consumers, those things take up a bigger piece of their budget, and that's one of the big pieces. And this is also why you have a Fed that you're going to see in a couple slides is divided, because you do have people that are still worried about the inflation impact. And particularly because the anticipation is that we probably have 6 to 12 months of sticky tariff inflation coming. Why is that? Because everyone has dealt with tariffs differently, right? And because there's been a lot of back and forth, and there continues to be a lot of back and forth and uncertainty. And so it's not like everyone put tariffs on immediately in the same way. Some people had pre-tariffed inventory, some people tried to wait, some people didn't have the consumer demand. And so we probably have 3 to 6 months that I think keeps inflation a little sticky, and that's why you have a Fed that has people that are still worried about the inflation piece, at the same time that you have people that are really worried about the employment half of the Fed's mandate. Right? The Fed has that dual mandate of stable prices and full employment, and right now the mixed signals are keeping risks to both. So I mentioned that per capita disposable income has slowed. Why has it slowed? Well, because labor demand has come down quite greatly. This is a chart that shows you hiring by month. I will say, I'm honest to a fault. I could have actually updated this data. We did get the ADP data yesterday, but I'm so out of practice after 37 days of not updating data, I forgot. So I'll just tell you what happened and fill in the data. The gray bars are your ADP private payroll. That is a data series we are still getting because it is private. The blue is your non-farm payroll series from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that we have not gotten. We would get a report tomorrow if things were open, but it's not. The other little asterisk is even once the government reopens, typically takes a month or two to start to get data, right? So that potentially puts us into next year, just keep that in mind. The two series, not perfectly aligned always in magnitude, but track pretty closely, and particularly if you look at the 3-month moving average, which is the dotted line, they're roughly in line. ADP was negative in September, negative 29 revised, but actually positive in October, the data we got yesterday. Sort of nets out though to pretty much flat growth. We don't need that missing data to be able to see that hiring has slowed, right? And I think that that was one of the things when we missed the September employment report, I thought, yeah, it would have served as confirmation, but we already know hiring has slowed, right? You can see it pretty clearly here. And that really is the big shift that you've seen this year. And it's coming from both uncertainty and AI investment, right? Both of those are factoring in. So what we're seeing in the labor market is kind of, again, like everything, different than usual. Because the softening we've seen and the concern that we're seeing is really on the hiring side, on the demand side. So this is kind of a full picture of the labor market. Again, 4 is the most charts I'll ever put on the slide. Actually, never say never. What do we have? Hires rate, quits rate, openings rate, layoffs rate, right? Left-hand side is your measure of labor demand. Hiring rate is well below its pre-pandemic average. That is obvious in that previous slide as well, right? Businesses are not hiring right now in mass, or really at all. And why is that? Again, some of it is uncertainty, right? People have not been able to predict what things are gonna look like this year or next year. And typically in times like that, they go, ooh, now's probably not a good time to hire people, right? And so we've definitely seen firms on the back foot thinking, we'll make do with the sort of reserves we have. And then the other part is also investment in technology, right? Look at the openings rate as well. That's come down. We're growing at about 4%, but not requiring more workers, right? You are starting to see that. And you are just starting to hear sort of whispers, and by whispers I mean real news, about layoffs starting. Some of that I think is tech sort of right-sizing maybe after big hiring, but some of it is also, you heard this last week from Amazon, adjusting because of productivity, because of investment in technology. And so the layoffs rate hasn't risen that much, but again, we only have data through August, but we are starting to see it creep up a little bit. Then the other thing is that workers feel the shift in the economy, right? And this is part of that, ooh, now's not a great time to buy a house, or ooh, now's not a great time to go out and consume a ton, because the quits rate is quite low. And that's, again, not because people are going, I love my job. Maybe some people are. But they're going, I'm really worried if I lose my job, I can't get another one. I heard this term job hugging, which you might think, again, a term of endearment, but it's, I'm hugging my job because I'm really worried if I lose it, no one's hiring right now. And that's the really big shift. And that's sort of what you've seen, and it's what the Fed is contending with, where we're looking at inflation that's still high, but a labor market that's also stalled. And we have seen the unemployment rate, particularly in the last couple of months, tick a little bit higher. Now, this is the zoomed in picture of the unemployment rate. The blue line is the national. The sort of bumpy green line is for the Charlotte MSA, which is a 3-month moving average because it's not seasonally adjusted data. But you'll notice moves it directionally the same as the US. What have we seen? Again, recently we've seen an increase in layoffs, right? You are starting to hear some signs of that. Now, some of what we've seen in the unemployment rate, and this is something Powell mentioned in his press conference last week, also has to do with labor supply, right? Because we're actually seeing flat labor supply at the same time that we're pretty much seeing flat labor growth, or labor demand growth, right? And so there are some that think maybe we're actually in balance, right? That if we're not seeing labor supply growing, we don't need to see demand growing. But that tick up in the unemployment rate probably has some people a little bit concerned. And it's particularly concerning when we look at duration of unemployment, right? And again, this speaks to that idea that consumers are feeling and that households are feeling that if they lose their job, it's going to be harder to get one, right? So the risk is in a period like this, if we start to see layoffs, but people aren't being hired, then we start to have people that become more longer term unemployed. And so when you look under the hood of that unemployment, which is what this is your duration, right? Of how long have those people been unemployed? Where are you seeing increases? At the shortest and the longest, right? So you're seeing that 5 weeks, less than 5 weeks, tick up a little bit, very gradually, right? So again, we're not hearing huge announcements until recently. We haven't really seen that many layoffs. But it's that red line, 27 weeks plus, that when people get let go, it's becoming really difficult to find a job and they're staying unemployed longer. And this becomes a whole sort of filters through the whole economy, right? Because that means people aren't consuming as much. It means people pull back. And those are the cracks that the Fed's a little worried about. But again, you have people on the Fed that are more worried and less worried about the labor market, and the same thing with inflation, right? There's definitely a slowdown in the labor market, but you have both sides of that risks for the inflation and the Fed's employment mandate. And so what do we have for the Fed, and what does it mean for interest rates? Well, we definitely have a Fed that has eased. They've cut twice this year. You can see the Fed funds target rate. I think it's pretty remarkable to see where we've come, right? We all get lost in where we are right now, but we had that rapid tightening into the face of inflation. We held at 5.5% on the top end of the Fed funds target rate. Then we cut, I always say they don't ask me. We didn't do anything, the Fed cut interest rates 100 basis points last year, 50 basis points to start, and then 225. Then we had an 8-month pause this year because of all this noise. And then the Fed finally cut in September, really because the risks that were brewing in the labor market, right? That soft hiring and that inflation that wasn't as bad as they were worried made them go, ooh, rates are too restrictive, we need to bring them down. They cut again last week at the October meeting, even though they had not gotten any data either, in large part because in 4 weeks, nothing had really changed, right? They cut in September as a risk management is what Powell classified it as, because they were worried about some of those underlying risks brewing in the labor market, and they wanted to get ahead of them as much as they could. And by October, again, we didn't have the data, but we knew the labor market hadn't picked back up, right? Takes a little bit longer. The really big shift that we got from Powell last week was in the press conference when he said a December rate cut is not a foregone conclusion, however. So the Fed has one more meeting this year, and this is one of the, they normally have either 4 weeks or 7 weeks between meetings. This is one of the 7 weeks. So they won't meet again until the first week of December. And so Powell, even though the median has one more rate cut in it, said December is not a foregone conclusion. Just because we cut in September and October, it doesn't mean we will again in December. The Fed also announced the end of their balance sheet reduction, QT, which has been ongoing to start December 1st, largely to stabilize the reserves. That is hopefully going to happen in the background as it has been happening, right? The reason they announced it in October to start in December is to give markets time to adjust. But the really big thing is the divergence of opinions on the Fed right now. And so who's who on the FOMC? The FOMC is made up, for anyone that's not aware, of 7 7 Fed governors who are congressionally appointed. Chair Powell is the current chair of the committee. And then there are 12 regional Fed presidents. Of the 12 presidents, every year 4 vote, and they rotate every year. So everyone that votes this year has one more meeting to vote. Everyone participates in the meeting, brings projections, discusses it. The way I've heard it is the first day everyone goes through their economic forecast, which you would think, I met a former New York Fed president. I said, oh my, the Fed meeting must be so exciting. And he was like, yeah, by update 4, you're kind of like, yeah, okay, I get it. We do 19 economic projections. Anyways, they all go through them, they all submit them. If we look at the hawkometer, which we have here, what is a hawk, what is a dove? Hawks are people who favor more restrictive policy. So right now, those are people that do not want more rate cuts. Doves are people that favor more easy monetary policy. So those who want more rate cuts, think rates are too restrictive. You'll notice we have a wide array of people, right? And you'll notice the voters are kind of evenly split. In October, we had 2 dissents in the official vote. We had Schmid, who's a regional Fed president, dissent in favor of no rate cut. He did not support the 25 basis point rate cut in September. Why? He thinks that growth is pretty strong. It's true. He's not that worried about the labor market. He thinks it's okay, but he's worried about inflation. So he didn't want to cut it. On the other end, you have Governor Myron, who is the newest Fed governor, who dissented in favor of a 50 basis point rate cut. Two extremes, right, for one meeting. A prime example of how the Fed is stuck between risks to both sides of their mandate right now. The governors, you'll notice, kind of center in the middle, with Chair Powell there in the middle. A lot of people, I'm sure, are going to ask, what does it mean in 2026 for who's who? Well, in some ways it means a lot, in other ways we'll have to see. What I mean by that is Chair Powell's term will end in May of next year. I believe he will finish his term out. There was some question around that earlier this year, but he will finish his term. He is asked at every single press conference almost by someone, will you stay on to fill your Board of Governors seat till 2028? And I think to myself, that journalist wasted a question because we know he's not going to answer it. And every time he goes, no comment. But he will be moving out of the chair position and he will be replaced. Just recently, the White House announced 5 people in the front running, of which 2 are Board of Governors members. You will see Chris Waller and Mickey Bowman. Both of them have been on the short list. Then there's Kevin Hassett, Kevin Warsh, and Rick Robin, I believe, is the third one. I think that list of 5 will probably come down to a list of 2 in the next month or 2, and I suspect Chris Waller will be one of the 2. He is the one that economists most often are behind, and why is that? Well, he's already on the Board of Governors, so it will be easier probably for him to build consensus, and he's probably the pick that also sends more of a central bank independence message. Now, we will see whoever's going to fill the seat. If they're not on the Board of Governors, will have to be in it by February 1st so that they can take over that term in May. Will that shift what happens on the Fed? Potentially, but also the thing I always remind people is it is a committee, right? Everyone votes, everyone discusses. Everyone submits their projections for the Fed funds rate, right? So we just looked at that wide array of where people are in the hawkometer, and it's pretty easy to see that wide array when you also look at the dot plot. So in September, everyone submitted their projections for the Fed funds rate at the end of this year. We don't get another dot plot until December. We didn't get one last week, so this is kind of the closest guide we have. Where are we right now? You can see where we are. There were 2 people in September who anticipated they would cut once more and no more. There are 9 people at the median with 1 more rate cut for December. That's that median that Powell said is not a foregone conclusion, given the fogginess that missing data is adding to an already mixed signals picture. And then you have the 1 dissent in favor of 50 basis points, the last 2 meetings, Governor Myron. That 50 basis points in December, I do think hangs the balance. I do think we're likely to get a 50 basis point cut, but it will remain to be seen based on the data that we get. I think the shutdown probably adds a little bit more likelihood to it because the longer it goes on, the more it is a growth risk and a labor market risk. But if we look at 26, we're not really going to talk about 27 or 28 because they're not sure about this year yet. But if we look at 26, there's 1 cut in the median, but that's not where the majority of dots are, right? You have a almost equally weighted cluster above the median, so people that don't really expect any cuts next year, depending on where we end this year. And then a cluster that falls a little bit below, so 2 or 3. What does that mean for 26? Well, it really is going to come down to how does the economy respond to the rate cuts that the Fed has already taken, right? Because you also have a neutral rate if you look at the longer run, which is where participants' projections for the longer run is, the neutral rate of 3%. We're at 3.754% right now, but you also have a cluster of people above, right? So some people that think we might actually be near that neutral rate. And that's why even though the Fed is easing, and typically when the Fed is in the middle of a tightening or easing cycle, there's more sort of clustering of the dots around the median, the closer you get to neutral, actually, the wider the dots can get. And so we have a Fed that is expected to continue to cut, but to what magnitude is really the big question now because of this fogginess that we have heading into 2026. So market expectations have adjusted a lot in the last week, particularly to what Powell said. In this chart, the red lines are expected cuts this year. The blue lines are cumulative expected cuts this year and next year. The dotted line is the Fed median, so what we just looked at. The red line is the solid line, is Fed funds futures taken from the market expectations. Where are markets? Well, Powell said December's not a foregone conclusion. Markets had been pretty much pricing in a December cut, and then they said, oop, just kidding. Now we're gonna sit at 50-50%. So markets sitting at 50-50. Again, the data that we will get will set the tone, right? We got this employment data this week that wasn't as bad. We also got an ISM manufacturing that actually came in a little bit better. New orders were up, but so were prices paid. So a little bit of both things. But when we look at 2026, that's also been a big sort of readjustment after last week's press conference. Markets were pricing in, they had one more cut this year, so that would have been a total of 3, and then they had 3 more cuts next year. But now they've backtracked a little, they've pulled one out, right? Why is that? Well, again, it's from what Powell said, but it's also from this, we gotta wait to see how the economy responds to the easing that's already gone, and particularly, what do we see in the labor market? Does it stabilize in response to this easing, particularly given that we're in this AI-driven sort of growth investment right now? And so what does it look like when we actually see those rates against the Fed funds rate? Because sometimes talking about 2 cuts, 3 cuts, I know it's hard to visualize. And what's our forecast? Blue line here is the Fed funds target rate. The dotted blue line is the Fed's median. The 2 diamonds are the range of opinions from the Fed, right? So you see that very wide range in 2026. The green line is our forecast from the beginning of October. We have 1 more cut this year, so a cut in December, and then officially we have 3 cuts in our forecast next year, 2 in the first half and 1 later in the second half. Caveat, I think there's a chance those cuts are a little bit less than 3 and come a little bit later. I think if we get a cut in December, you could see a Fed that goes back to a little bit of wait and see. Wait to see how the economy responds to those rate cuts, and particularly when we think about what we've seen on the long end of the Treasury curve in the last week as well. We haven't seen the long end come down that much, right? There's this expectation, I think, that people, a little misguided, that the Fed's gonna cut rates and all rates come down. Well, no, the Fed funds controls the short end of the curve, but not necessarily the long. And so we have here as well, the 10-year Treasury yield, which is the red line. It's a lot of where people do business. And our forecast for that, we have seen the 10-year go up a little bit, 4.15, I believe, yesterday. But our forecast is that we do see the curve come down a little bit, but not that much, right? More in that sort of 3.9 next year, a steepening at the front end if the Fed eases, but still some long end pressure. Some of that coming from things outside of the Fed's control. And so that is all I have prepared. You see my disclaimer. But I think the biggest thing really as we are here now is, right, there's a little bit of everything. And there's like multiple economies going on at once, right? Growth has been better, but not everyone feels that, right? This AI-driven investment is really new for all of us. Businesses are figuring out and responding to how things are changing rapidly, and it's very different, right? And there's also a lot of questions of, all right, well, how does this work in the short term for employees, right? For people that are maybe displaced versus the longer term, right? How do people fit into this AI-driven world? I think that's going to continue to be really at the forefront of what's driving the economy and some of these questions. I do think if we see the labor market start to stabilize after these rate cuts the Fed's taken, the really big focus will shift back next year to where is inflation, right? Because at 3%, it is still above the Fed's target, and that's not where they want it to be. And so with that, I think I have about 10 minutes. If we have any questions. Yes?
The
Stunning.
change in the insurance,
Yeah. Change in,
vehicle insurance.
yeah, crazy, huh? Do you mean what's driving it, what's happening? So from what I don't have a car. I ride a bicycle, and I don't even own it. It's an electric city bike, because I'm a cheater. What's driving car insurance? Well, part of it is that car prices have risen so drastically. You actually saw the price of a new car cross the average price cost $50,000 recently. So some of it is that, right? The cars are more expensive. Some of it is also from some statistics that I've read that post-pandemic we've had some more accidents and people's driving has gotten worse, which, no comment. But I think that those are the biggest factor is the cost of cars, the cost of maintenance and repair as well. All of those have seen pretty remarkable appreciation in the last 5 years and factor in. But I know it's a huge, people tell me about it. all the time that it's real and they feel it. And right, if you have a teenager who's driving in more than one car, you really notice it. And I think it is also a big factor, right? Home insurance has gone up quite a bit in a lot of places. Florida and California get a lot of bad press, obviously for that. And then medical insurance is another really big one I didn't touch on, but that also is a big question mark right now as well, and debate. And that's not only for the consumer, but also for businesses that provide health insurance. I actually think that that is part of the reason why businesses are investing in technology and not people, because some of the associated costs with employees have gotten so high, like the benefit costs. So it's a huge sort of storm, to answer your question and more than just your question. Anything else? Oh, yes.
Bob Hogus, Jackson County Commissioner. Do you housing,
Yeah.
you touched on briefly and expanded, but in watching the global activity in housing, seeing what's getting ready to probably take place in the next 6-9 months in Florida, with the collapse of their growth and their markets plummeting. I mean, I'm not talking about a small decrease. I mean, it's huge what's going to happen. Is that going to have some national implications as well in terms of what happens with those people who are now so deep underwater?
Yeah, great question. Also, I think you were one of the newly elected individuals. No, just kidding. Never mind. No, congrats to you then. Just kidding. Congrats on continuing. Housing is one of the things, understandably, that really matters to the whole economy, but also that we also have a lot of sort of trauma about from the great financial crisis. There are absolutely markets that are correcting. The first Austin was one that was sort of, in the last couple of years, the poster child first of, oh my gosh, look at this boom, and then, oh my gosh, look at these rent reductions. Florida is another one that's having a lot of correction. I think there are absolutely some risks in markets. I don't see anything systemic like what we saw in the great financial crisis, in large part because lending standards have changed so much since then. I think the really big risk becomes that you have seen this unbelievable appreciation, right? That if you don't continue to see that, becomes a big sort of pullback on that group spending. I will say though, it is a big sort of middle class problem, right? I was just down in Miami, and let me tell you, the top 10% there are fine. They are buying houses in cash, I've heard. And so again, I think it's another thing that's a burden, particularly on the middle class, right? And that's where the biggest risk is. I also think one of the interesting pieces of what we're seeing in the housing market right now is also what it means for this next generation. You have a young group that suddenly has a very different mentality towards housing than we've had in the past, I think, in that, the American dream was to own a home, but you have this younger generation that feels like it's not accessible. And so they're shifting how they think about housing. They're thinking, I may never buy a house, so do I even save for one? Do I commit to being a renter? And I think that will factor into part of what you see in housing. I do think you're gonna see corrections in certain markets. Florida's gonna have a couple of them, but there are a couple other places. I will say though, largely, there was a ton of movement into the southeast, right? While you're seeing some corrections in places again, like South Florida, maybe sort of northern Florida as well, by and large, you're not seeing people that move to the southeast leave, right, in other regions. And so that, I think, becomes a boom, or sort of a stabilization as you do start to see some corrections in certain places. You're welcome.
Do you have a blog?
Do I have a, great question. The question was, do I have a blog? I wish. No, I don't, but I do write a monthly economic digest that is very digestible for First Horizon clients and maybe prospects. So if you don't already bank with First Horizon, we have an incredible table of bankers right here you could reach out to. No, but I will say my colleague has a podcast I've been on a couple times called Simply Put. It's on Spotify, all your streaming platforms, by Will Compernol. I've been on it, I was on the last episode. So if you're into podcasts, you could check that out. I'll be on it, I think, again at the end of this year, and he does a great job as well, and that's for everyone because it's a podcast. But yes, First Horizon, table in the front. stunning. He didn't even know he was going to be our PR guru. I think we have time for one more if anyone has a lingering final question. And for the first time in a long time, I don't have to run out. So I will be here afterwards as well if there are any sort of lingering questions or one-off questions. All right, well, seeing none, thank you all so much again for coming and for having me again.
All right, so I'm Pat Munker with the GBA. I have 0 slides. So Sophia and I were talking about, she mentioned it when she got up here, this is 3rd or 4th year running, and it gets harder and harder and harder. And I joked with her, just put up a blank slide and said, we don't have any data. So I'm amazed at what you did with 0 data. I'm a little concerned if you had the data and what we would have heard. But as always, thank you for taking an incredibly complex set of dynamics and being able to articulate that for the regular people out there like us. It's fascinating how you can do that. An economist with a sense of humor too, not often you find that. So thanks for traveling down here, and good luck when you get back to New York City. So as we usually do, is that's great information, and Sophia also brought it down to some level here regionally. But we asked the question, kind of, so what? What does that mean to us here in Gaston County? And so we've done this the past several years where we have asked some local business leaders in certain sectors to join us on a panel to talk about, all right, what we heard from Sophia, how's that impacting your business? And this could go on literally all afternoon because we have representation, and I'll ask the panelists to come up. So this is Chris, CaroMont. So healthcare is dramatically impacted by this. Tilly Hebert with Man and Hummel is on our panel if y'all could come up. So manufacturing tariffs are impacted. Martha Wegner with Duke Energy. We heard about energy prices and the impact of growth in energy. And then Rob Presley with Mecca is in the real estate sector. So you can see how really there's a connection throughout all of Sophia's comments to every one of these sectors. So I have some questions that I've developed. These guys know basically the questions, so I'm not going to hit them up on the cold. But what I'd like to do is just start, maybe start, Tilly, with you. Just tell us a little about who you are, what you do, your company, and then we'll get into some of the more detailed questions.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tilly Hebert. I am a senior manager in the HR function for Man and Hummel. I have been in manufacturing for over 20 years at this point. I've been with Man and Hummel for the last 18 months. Thank you for having me.
Good morning, I'm Rob Presley, President of Mecca Commercial Real Estate. We are a 50-year-old commercial real estate company. We deal in brokerage, management, and development, primarily commercial real estate. I have been with the company for 33 years and have a pretty diverse background in development and brokerage.
Martha Wegner, I am the Director of Government and Community Relations for Duke Energy. I manage the Mecklenburg, Gaston, and Union County areas, and my team manages the entire western part of the state of North Carolina. Good to be here.
Good morning, I'm Chris Peete, President and CEO of CaroMont Health, which is the largest independent healthcare system in the state of North Carolina that is located right here in your hometown. And so we're delighted to continue to serve you, and we'll be talking a bit more about that today.
All right, well, let's jump into the hard questions. So Tilly and I spent some time together last week talking about prepping for this, but I was just fascinated by the intricacies of a global company in manufacturing and sort of the systemic issues that impact you. And since tariffs are top of mind at the Supreme Court today and other places, help us understand in this tariff world how Man and Hummel is navigating that and seeing from the tariff environment?
We're always assessing, but I think just with the tariffs, supply chain is a big one that we're looking at right now. For us, we're looking at our vendors, we're looking at what they can do, tariffs, whether they're, what we've heard is different companies that are doing different things, right? So some are rolling down these costs to the customers, others are looking at efficiencies, and we are looking at those things. I think one of the things that sometimes when I have to answer this question, people think that when we're talking about tariffs and when we're looking at the cost, we can just turn off the faucet in one country and turn it on in the US. And this process of looking at our products, because we're not necessarily comparing apples to oranges, we have different products, different requirements, we have to look at everything, our supply chain, we have to look at manpower and make some decisions. It can take a really, really long time. So for us, there are a whole lot of steps that we need to take when we're talking about tariffs and looking at what we need to do as a business, as a global manufacturer to make certain decisions. And those decisions are never from one day to the next. They take a really long time.
This will likely be a theme from everybody, just the complexity of the world and the challenge to make decisions leading your company. With that in mind, I want to jump to Martha. We were chatting a bit earlier just about the sort of infrastructure that we see every day. So roads are a challenge. You get it, you're in it every day. To some degree, utilities, water, sewer, you see construction happening all over the place. But power is this magical thing that just comes out of the wall, and it's really easy to make that happen, and it's not. And so the complexity of that is challenging. And the growth numbers of this area and the demand of power, it was astounding to me to hear what that is. So Martha, if you could help the audience just understand the lay of the land. And one other quick thing, I know that Sophia mentioned this, data centers are driving a lot of consumption. That's not exactly the case here in Gaston. It is in North Carolina broadly, but I was having a conversation with Donnie, who's left, and we had another appointment. But he said it's not just data centers that are drawing power. So industrial manufacturing operations are increasing their demand for power. So it is an issue for us here in Gaston as well. Martha.
Yeah, and thank you for driving an electric bike. So thank you for that. And I have statistics because I cannot remember all of those. So my area, Mecklenburg, Gaston, and Union. So this is what I'll be talking about. This is data that I got from our operations folks. So if you're saying our region's been told that we're growing 157 people a day, and I want to tell you that not a single one of those 157 people don't want electricity. They do. They all do. When I lived in Asheville, I thought it was so cool because when the power went out, nobody noticed. They were all off the grid. Not true. Not true. So from a 40-year veteran, I'll just tell you, I know one person off the grid. And he's pretty crazy. So not you, Commissioner, not you. So let's say 157 people a day, 2.5 people, we'll assume that per household, equals roughly 63 new residences per day, 23,000 new homes every year. Average electricity use in North Carolina is around 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. I can break down what a kilowatt hour is, but so let's just say they're using 31 megawatts on average around the clock every year. And that's before you count, because these people who are coming, these 157 people a day, go to the grocery store, they go to Lowe's, they want a haircut, they have pets that need grooming, they have schools, they have other businesses that they're going to be participating in for the economy. So let's talk about the scale of that. What is a 31 megawatts? If you talk about solar, which we're in the solar business, it's requiring, if to get that 31 megawatts, I need 145 megawatts of solar output. And that takes up thousands of acres of property to get that, just for the just for the new residents that aren't keeping up. So we can talk a little bit more about that. So data centers, and I wish Donnie was here, but it's not just data centers, it's advanced manufacturing. North Carolina is a growing state. When we had the pandemic and we could not get transformers and things for our business, we went to northern utilities and they took them out of the field because they weren't growing. You know, we got transformers and meters and things like that. So it's a good problem to have. But so talk about the infrastructure, and we'll talk more about data centers because I got a feeling that's coming up. But this is one thing that I got from our operations folks. Roads and highways. North Carolina DOT is widening I-85. We're going to feel the benefit of that. And I-77 all the way to South Carolina border. Okay, good, right? We're on the list for that. But these two projects represent a $5 billion investment. And this expansion, I-77 expansion, is the largest North Carolina DOT project ever built. And together, these two projects account for 1/3 of the DOT total investment in this region over the next decade. And every one of these projects, we're already working on it, that require utility relocations. That bridge over 85, there is no magic wand. I don't have one. So it requires wires, it requires underground feeders, tight timelines, congested corridors. It requires a lot of new, and we'll talk further about that, but so yeah, the infrastructure, it's coming, hold on.
Yeah, so another common theme you're gonna hear is growth, and with that, I wanna go over to Chris. So Chris has the fun job of trying to serve more people each year to the growth and an aging economy. So tell us just a little bit about where you see that growth impacting CaroMont.
It's all easy, right?
Yeah.
No problems. You know, it's interesting, the growth is actually pretty phenomenal in this area. And there's a direct correlation between humans and healthcare. It's just direct. It's interesting as healthcare has kind of taken front and center seat in what's going on right now, right? In Washington, there's a lot of conversation around the shutdown being related to some healthcare public policy. And, you know, we're kind of in an environment whereby we have a wonderful country, but we have a healthcare system that we can't afford. Some projections even have, you know, one I read was 20.3% of the GDP by 2035 would be allocated to healthcare. That's 20 cents out of every dollar. That's pretty significant. And so to accommodate that with the growth, we have to transform the healthcare system in America with regard to both cost and delivery. The challenge with that is that the medicine that we practice in the United States is certainly equal to that of around the world. But maybe the behaviors that we have in the United States are not exactly the same as those in other countries that create that additional demand. For example, I was not able to keep some of you from getting that extra half pound of bacon this morning when you went through the line, right? So that's going to have impacts on how we live and how the choices that we make. The demand that is created both in population growth, aging, and in lower health status. So from a strategic standpoint, Pat, part of our mission, our vision, and the challenge for us is to keep you out of the hospital. And I know that's why is the CEO of the hospital saying, I need to keep you out of the hospital? Because the hospital is the highest cost point of healthcare delivery. And so our intention is to continue to create and add ambulatory access to care. So we have, over the last 9 years since I've been there, we've invested almost $500 million in additional infrastructure to create, now we do have some inpatient in that, but to create more points of care that are at lower cost points, that are easier access, that with the intention of keeping you healthier so the level of acuity doesn't continue to go up and you require the more expensive access to care. So part of our strategy to meet the growing demand is to continue to create additional access points Also with that is to continue to use and invest in advanced technology. For example, 10 years ago, MRIs could see about 12, 13 patients a day. New MRIs can see 23, 24 patients a day. That's a big efficiency in how you are able to provide service in a different way, in a more cost-effective way, while meeting the increasing demands. So Patrick, I think it is an investment in, again, more access points closer to home, and an investment in technology that makes the patient experience more efficient.
Great, thank you, Kevin. All right, Rob, let's see what's going on in the real estate world. So we talk about growth, and you are front and center on growth issues. And maybe let's go back to some of Sophia's points, kind of capital markets, rates. You and I talked about rent rates, and we sort of met sort of the top of rent rates. So give us an oversight of this growth, maybe what type of product you see coming to Gaston, and then what you've heard throughout these conversations, how does that impact your approach to your business?
Well, I'll start by saying that in 2009, my crystal ball broke, so I no longer can predict what's going to happen in the future. But I can look at what's trending, much like The Economist. Interest rates, construction cost, land cost, soft cost, professional fees, all those things have increased tremendously over the last 10 years, particularly the last 5 years. And the real estate industry has been able to offset that by increased sales prices, increased rental rates. But as Pat mentioned, we spoke the other day, I think the rent appreciation and sales price appreciation has kind of maxed out at this point. Our corporate tenants, our business tenants are all saying, we just can't afford it anymore. I mean, we're leasing industrial space today for $14, $15 a square foot. 10 years ago, it was $7 or $8 a square foot. When I started in my career, it was $2 or $3 a square foot. So fortunately, our rents and our sales prices have been able to keep up, but I think we've just maxed out at this point. And while I'm not in the residential business, our company serves all the major home builders in the region. We sell a tremendous amount of land to the home builders, and we're seeing a retraction. We're seeing contracts get dropped right now. The home builders want to build. They make money by building houses, but with interest rates, construction costs, and then a whole generation of kids, first-time home buyers, sitting on the sidelines because they think that rates are going to go back down to 2.9%. It's just stalled out. And so the residential industry was able to kind of maneuver a little bit by moving from single-family homes to townhomes. So all of a sudden there was this mass influx of townhomes. Now the townhomes is out of flavor. They've overbuilt the townhomes and they're starting to retract on townhomes. And we're seeing all the big companies drop contracts. And we're in one of the highest growth portions of the country and this is occurring. So you can only imagine what's going on in slower growth portions of the country. The other thing that's, also talked to a little bit about, the other pressures beyond economic pressures are political pressures and growth, particularly in counties like Gaston County. Gaston didn't see a whole lot of economic development for a number of decades. And after textiles started to leave the area, Gaston kind of stayed flat for a long time. But over the last 10, 15 years, all of a sudden, Gaston's a popular place. And so folks are coming here, folks want to be here, but what's happening is the infrastructure can't handle it. Y'all spoke about infrastructure, but here we have not just roads, but water, sewer, trash, fire, police, all the services that it takes to serve all these new homes and businesses that are coming. And so the politicians in all the towns around Gaston County are in a difficult spot for two reasons. One, most of them are not professionals from this industry and are trying to make decisions based on their own background. The planning staffs are trying to keep up and provide information to these elected officials, but they're hearing on one hand, we don't want growth. We don't want growth. On the other hand, growth's coming whether you want it or not. But I would say the biggest challenge in Gaston County right now, beyond the other commonalities around the country, financial related, is infrastructure. And Gaston is going to have to ramp up its infrastructure spending, particularly in the areas of water, sewer.
And there's another dynamic, we'll get into that, 'cause it's more public policy, but you know, residential construction, residential development, just the property taxes, even with rising appreciation of units, likely doesn't pay for the huge expense of extending water, sewer, expanding roads. So it's a really tough dynamic and in a very emotional world. So hopefully over time we can talk about the facts and recalibrate expectations. But even in Mecklenburg that passed the additional 1 cent sales tax for transportation, the marketing campaign was reduce congestion. I thought it's never going to reduce congestion. What it will do is mitigate the increased congestion that's coming because of growth. So if we expect, you know, Michael Peoples as the city manager of Gastonia to make all the roads clear so that we don't have any traffic in front of us, that's delusional. And we just, somehow we have to recalibrate that, and it's coming quickly to Gaston. So one thing we haven't discussed a lot here is labor. I know Sophia said labor issues are kind of neutral now. I'm wondering if that's true here in Gaston. And I know, Tilly, you and I talked a good bit about this, especially due to a lot of the policy constraints, H-1B visas and immigration, and you're dealing with this in an international company. So help us understand from your perspective where we are on the need for talent and workforce.
I will say, like many companies, right now we are not hiring as we were probably 2 years ago. From the immigration aspect, I will say, you know, immigration in the United States is expensive and unpredictable. With all the changes that are happening with this administration, it's a daily change. So we spend a lot of time tracking court cases and changes in regulation, and it is time consuming, sometimes confusing, because we're not getting really much guidance for some time. And so we tend to have to figure a lot of things out ourselves before we get some real or additional guidance from the government. You know, what we have seen is the biggest impact we've had so far is the change in the temporary protected status programs that have had legal immigrants lose their work authorization, you know, overnight. So for us, we're a pretty big company in the U.S. We have over 3,000 people with, you know, with our different clusters or divisions. We've been impacted. I think 1.2% of those employees have been impacted. For us, we've done our best to ensure that those employees that have been impacted, we have treated them and done what was necessary with dignity and respect. That's our priority. As far as H-1B, I think manufacturing has always been, there's the cost of fees, but also you're talking about lawyers. There's so much involved with the H-1B process. It takes so long. So we are very, you know, selective for those positions that we choose to go through the H-1B process with. And then when you're bringing someone from overseas, you really don't know from a culture perspective if they're going to fit in as well. So all those things are what we have to plan and think about when we're considering someone. We also have to show the U.S. government that we are unable to find a U.S. applicant who fits or who's able to take that role. It's not just, oh, we willy-nilly just go out there and say, oh, well, we can't find someone. We have to post and we have to show that we're unable to find someone. So that process, it's already expensive. To add this on top of it, right now, we don't see a big impact from like bringing people in for H-1Bs. I think other industries are going to see that more than we will, but that's where we're at. As far as labor, I think you know, Sophia said, it's very, we're in a kind of the word of the year, the uncertainty, the looking at localization, and trying to determine those things. So.
Yeah, and we could probably have a whole other session on just labor demands, because as Rob mentioned, when home builders stop projects, well, now those framers don't have a job, and I'm hearing kind of the framers are leaving town. Well, think about when the developers want to start back up, you don't have the talent here, so everything just takes longer than most people probably understand. I know, Martha, you all have been facing just your line workers that are aging out and retiring, and Chris constantly is battling the need for nurses. So while there's this, we can overlay national numbers, I think locally we have to be really cognizant of what are the dynamics on the ground here because of this rapid growth. Chris, looking ahead, what external economic forces are you going to be most closely watching in the years ahead in your business?
Great question. Initially, of course, what's staring us in the face right now is the federal public policy, right? There's, the House Resolution 1, some refer to it with a descriptive adjective of beautiful bill, but that's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. For healthcare, it's a little bit of a challenging public policy. To the implication to the state of North Carolina, that bill alone will reduce the allocation for healthcare funding by $4.6 billion annually, starting in 2027. So get the gravity, get the gravity of that, $4.6 billion that is coming less. Now, are patients going to have less need for healthcare? No, they're not. So that is a bit of a challenging math problem for every healthcare system across the state of North Carolina. And so those are things that are going to transform the decisions that we make in healthcare. Healthcare, like every other business, has certain things you have positive margin on, and in healthcare, a lot of things that you have the opposite. But you do it because it's important to the community, it's important to the patient, and it's a moral imperative. At the same point, you still have to have, even though we're 501c3, and our intention, our mission is not to make money return to a shareholder, but it is to be able to reinvest and to continue to provide the highest level of care to patients through technology, through infrastructure, through quality, physicians, through talent. And so it's important that we have enough margin to be able to reinvest and to be able to do those things that are required or needed but do not have positive financial impact to the organization. For example, behavioral health. That is a space that is basically a negative margin business. That's why you do not see a proliferation of behavioral health units around the state or around the country. Do we need it? Absolutely. Absolutely. We need it more than ever. But the problem is the math doesn't work, right? It's just you can't afford to provide the service. So in a hospital setting, that is part of what we do with an entire floor dedicated to behavioral health. But in order to pay for that, I have to be able to make margin in other spaces. Well, part of that, when you have the majority of your inpatients are Medicare or Medicaid patients, that is a federal and state funded. That's the way that it's paid for. The care is paid for those patients. And when you got 60+% of that as your business, and let's say your portion of that 4.6 billion goes away, your math problem gets a bit more challenging. So with regard to understanding what's happening for us, it will be public policy. But at the same point, we're not going to sit back and wait on someone to fix that for us, right? As a business that is committed to providing a needed service to a community, we have to adapt and adjust. And we may have to change the way that we do business within the constraints of the revenue that's provided. But we will figure that out. We will solve that. But it is something that's coming down the pipe quickly and something that we will be monitoring very, very closely over the next couple of years.
I've been tracking this at a high level, certainly nowhere near the detail you and your team do, but you hear federal folks wringing their hands, oh my gosh, Medicare, Medicaid, but they pass it then into the state. And then the state wrings their hands and says, oh, we're gonna have to cut, and they cut and move on to the next thing. This guy and people like him, the buck stops there. And so it's a huge challenge locally for us, and I appreciate the leadership you're providing that, because it is tough math. And speaking of tough math, I'll go back to Martha, and some of you may see this across the country. There is now angst in some communities when data centers want to come, huge cost for the energy requirements, and regular consumers are saying, I don't want to pay for that. Don't jack up my rate for my house by 50% so that private industry can get the power for what they need. And I know Duke is really vigilant about holding down costs, but I just wonder about how, with the myriad of different generation opportunities for providing power that you all have, how that might help ease some of the regular residential consumers and how they can be protected from that challenge.
Okay, so let me give you some input about data centers. Data centers are coming, and if we do not get them when they locate, we will never get them. The states that they locate in, that's where they'll stay, because there's a significant infrastructure engagement for them, investment for them. But I'll tell you a little secret. They pay for their infrastructure. So it benefits all of us. We are a highly regulated company. We don't raise prices because we've had a bad year. We don't do that. We go before the Utilities Commission in North Carolina. We have rate hearings. We don't do it on our own, and most of that is backward looking. We don't go and get rate increases for what is projected. So data centers pay for their own, and they'll tell us, we'll pay the delta for what it costs you to serve us up front. We'll pay for that because they need it and they know they need it. So don't worry about that. What they will do is take a lot of water and sewer. So my elected officials in here will know that's a huge, huge concern. When they'll pay for the infrastructure, that'll probably be what they include as well. So, so that's data centers. That's a lot. Of the Googles of the world will sit there and tell you we want energy that is not a fossil fuel. Then you're probably not going to be operating at 3 in the morning, because we don't have, at this point in time, we don't have Gaston County has land. There's not a lot of places that have land. So that's why they're looking for these big properties. But, so let's talk about where we get it. We have a mixed generation. We have nuclear, and we want new nuclear. We love that. We love small modular reactors. We've got the water that'll serve it. We've got the infrastructure. We've got the property. We don't have anybody building them. The person who was building it, the company that was building it, is not doing it right now. So we've got to stand up, as you said, we've got to make it ourselves. We've got to do that. So we're working hard to do that. Is it going to be 10 to 12 years? Yeah, it probably will. And our friends at the gas company, you may not want fossil fuels. We're out of the coal business. We know that here in Gaston County. The Allenstein plant is almost, if you haven't seen it, most of those stacks that look, the red and white stacks, they're gone. And we've recycled about 90% of the material that was on that property. Riverbend, here in Gaston County, will be one of our next battery storage sites. So let's talk about that a little bit. Wind, we're not going to do it much in North Carolina. We just don't. Offshore wind is not palatable. We have regulations in the mountains that no wind will be built, even though in other countries you see them and they're able to farm and have animals underneath those winds. It's just not practical here right now. Solar is an issue that we have with the copious amounts of land that it takes, and it doesn't have the ability to serve when you need it. Battery storage. So this is what we're doing in a lot of places, but in Gaston County, we are having utility scale batteries. And we have a nuclear plant at the northern part of Mecklenburg County called McGuire on Lake Norman. We have a nuclear plant called Catawba on Lake Wiley, just over the South Carolina line. So we are sitting here beautifully between two behemoth nuclear plants. But you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't switch those off. You don't sit there and go, you know, nobody needs you, we're just gonna shut you down for a little bit. That's not how it works. But the batteries that we're putting at Riverbend and at Allen, at those sites, it can be fed into those utility scale batteries. And when we have really cold mornings, like we're probably gonna have Tuesday, we can have the additional load that we need above just normal capacity for those 2 or 3 hours out of those batteries. That we don't have to start up another unit, that we don't have to have. But gas is gonna be critical for us. To get out of fossil fuels, to get out of coal, we've gotta go with another fossil fuel as a bridge fuel to serve the tremendous transformational growth that we have. And that's gonna have to be through natural gas, which is a cleaner fuel. And in the meantime, we'll be working on that 10 or 12 years for nuclear that we need, because we have that capacity. And Patrick, I want to say about the infrastructure, no one seems to want a substation in their backyard. I don't get it. Those transmission lines are beautiful to me, but we need about 8 more to serve just what's on the book. 8 more substation sites. Now you wonder why I'm tired and look old, because I am old. But you try to get substations in uptown Charlotte, and I need 4. Because Tepper's gonna have this little thing that's called a new building stadium, and he's gonna have new performing arts, and the Spectrum Center's just been done, and the Knights are playing, and they love to play at night, and we love the lights. I am stretched. When you say stretched, we had a transfer trailer truck that took out 8 poles the day of Fan Fest, and I'm gonna tell you, if you ever want to see an executive at Duke Energy hyperventilate, I saw it. We brought people up from South Carolina and from, we had them flying from Florida up here going, we need help, because there's something about, you have to get it done. And so if you've got 10 acres that's on the energy need, and you might want to talk to me afterwards, I need about 8 of those. And highly interested. There's no low-hanging fruit, it's all gone. So we will say, we're going to make it work. We have an obligation to serve, and we will serve you. But you may not like everywhere we put it. It's just going to have to happen, though.
So hopefully you all get out of these forums some information you didn't know before. And so I wanted Martha to go through all that to help us understand the reality of this, the complexity, what is the pricing structure, who pays for what, how does that work? Because this is an environment, a social environment, I call it bumper sticker, where people can yell and scream. You can be negative in a bumper sticker. It just took 3 minutes to explain it, and people aren't going to wait 3 minutes to listen. But it's important that we understand these dynamics. So, Rob, before we open it up to some questions of the audience, we've heard an awful lot of great information about the dynamics here in Gaston County. As somebody that's really got your ear to the ground on the growth dynamic, what do you see that's going to entice development in Gaston, good quality development in a relative perspective, meaning versus other parts of this region? How do you see us continuing this momentum that we've had?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question, and some people may not like the answer I'm going to give.
Always that risk when I ask you a question, Robert.
The development wants to come here. Home builders want to come here. Corporations want to come here. The question is, does Gaston County want them to come? I'll give you an example. I'm working on a development right now, 200,000 square foot industrial flex project. My first tenant is a $1 billion national corporation to lease the first building we're going to build. The tooth and nail going through getting entitlements, getting the community to say, oh, we want this $30 million project that generates a tremendous amount of taxes in our community. It's Gaston in a lot of places has become, we don't want things to change. We don't want any growth. We don't want that. We don't want this. And it's coming. But in my case, we finally got all of our approvals, and just before starting construction, my contractor did a flow test. There's half the amount of water flow and pressure that there should be for the town. It's not enough water pressure to support my fire suppression systems in the building. So I can't even build the building until the water lines are increased in size to allow for enough flow of water into the town to put out a fire should one occur. And this is a problem that the citizens and the elected officials have known about for many years. They've just done nothing about it. So now my project stalled. I'm in jeopardy of losing the tenant. So the question really is, does Gaston want this? I've got 2 other developments in Gaston County, and I'm fighting with the municipalities tooth and nail right now over silly stuff that shouldn't even be discussed, like traffic. I'm on an 8-lane highway, state highway. Why would I have to go spend $20,000 to do a traffic study when they're going to dump on an 8-lane highway that has a tremendous amount of capacity? So the municipalities in Gaston need to look inward and say, do we want growth here? And if we do, then what do we need to do to attract it? Donnie can run around, and Donnie and I talk on a regular basis. Donnie runs into this same problem. My whole team of people in my Gaston office here run into this same problem. People can say they want it, but when it comes time to actually, it's like your substation. They want power, but they don't want a substation. You know, I look at social media, which I shouldn't, but I love the Gaston County social media that says, when are we getting to Trader Joe's? You're not getting to Trader Joe's. Not anytime soon, because you don't have enough population. You don't have politicians who want the growth and the citizens that want the growth to come that would lead to the population, that would lead to the Trader Joe's. So that's where we're at. And I understand it. Gaston's going through a period of, this isn't the place I grew up in. This wasn't what it was like 50 years ago. No, nowhere in the country is. And you can go, it's not, nobody's picking on Gaston. It's happening all across the region. It's happening all across the Carolinas. We are a popular place to be. People are relocating here. They're going to continue to come. They're going to continue to build houses, and you just need to be prepared. I've said repeatedly to several towns in Gaston County, you have a choice. I can be Davidson-esque, or I can be Pineville. Nothing against Pineville, but Pineville allowed a whole lot of growth to come through in a short period of time, and they're paying the price now trying to fix some of the problems that occurred in the 80s and 90s. Davidson, on the other hand, said, we want growth, but it's going to be smart growth, and it's going to be under our terms. So we as a community in Gaston County just need to acknowledge growth is coming, and let's prepare for it, and let's start investing in our infrastructure and start figuring out ways to lure the things we want, as opposed to fighting everything that's coming because we're scared there might be 2 more cars on the road.
Yeah, I think that's a great encapsulation of growth, and part of this is how can we collectively establish what's the future state, and I'm talking 20, 30 years from now, of Gaston. And if we say, yep, that's where we want to be, that will bring my children back, that will be great. Okay, if we're not doing anything intentionally to get there, where do we end up in 30 years? And sometimes I think we're so in the moment, because that's just life, we don't pause enough to see, wait a minute, how does what I've done today impact where we're going to be in 30 years? Well, I think of the work your dad did, Rob, in South End in Charlotte. And that's this instant success that took 30 years. And it was public, it was private, it was public policy. It was tough sledding for a long time. Now, a lot of people may say, great, but I don't like any of that, and I get that. But there are thousands of people that are choosing that as a choice of a living style. And I think Gaston has a great opportunity to provide that choice, not to dictate, but suggest you can have a dense urban environment. You can live in a single family home if you'd like. We have all of that opportunity here. But hopefully organizations like ours and business leaders like you can help us with those discussions in the community because they're critical. All right, we have a few minutes here for some open mic questions. Everybody said they were cool with that, but please don't beat up anybody on the pen. Be thoughtful in that question. Any questions? Susie?
So, I totally get what Rob is talking about, and I have seen this because we've worked and built things for the town of Fort Mill for Pineville, in Cabarrus County, and I know that years ago, Concord, insisted for a development that you had to, if you wanted to build in their area, you had to designate a piece of that property to be for a future school or a park or something along those lines, which they said, oh, if they do that, people will never build there. Well, they did, and they did in Fort Mill. And so how can we, as a county, with its individual communities that each have their own personality and desires and wants and needs, how can we collectively pull that together and reach out to the Davidsons, the Pinevilles, the Fort Mills, and say, what do you wish you knew 20 years ago? What decisions would you make differently? What have you learned, and how can we learn from that so we can have smart growth and not just whatever happens?
I think it's a wonderful idea. Learning from others is an incredible way. The great thing about Gaston being the last to the table with economic development in the region is you're a clean slate who gets to learn from positive and negative things that occurred around other parts of the region. But you have to make the initiative to invite these people over, to put together task force, to get together community meetings. What I'm watching in Gaston is it's whoever the loudest people are tend to be where the fire gets put out. And so the politicians are going, oh Lord, they're upset over in this neighborhood, or oh Lord, they're upset over here, let's appease them. That's not good urban planning. That's not good community building. Politicians hire planning staffs, and they're not even listening to them. They're listening to their constituents who voted for them. Listen to your planning staffs. Listen to your professionals that you have on your team. And not who your constituents are important, but it's each piece coming together and getting information, and communities and towns deciding this is how we want to grow. We have an affordable housing issue. There are ways to incorporate affordable housing into any new development. We don't lack land and parks as much as we do infrastructure. So can you get the developers to help pay for some of that? Yes, but you have to be careful. And impact fees were something that came up 20 years ago, and then it wasn't until the building industry sued the municipalities and got rid of the impact fees, citing those were illegal. So you have to be careful, because if you pile too much on the builder developer, you're going to see prices go through the roof, and then you're going to be unaffordable. You're not going to have any affordable housing because you've dumped so much infrastructure responsibility on the developer. So it's a fine line, if you will. It's fair to ask developers to contribute and participate, but the community's going to have to do the same. The communities just need to figure out what's important to them. Is affordable housing important to us? Is water sewer important to us? Are roads important to us? Is schools important to us? And you could probably say all these are important, but there's also priorities of where are we suffering the most right now? I mean, Gaston County's, to me, its biggest problem is water sewer. There is so many parts, there's a ton of land in Gaston County, but there's no utilities accessible to it. So it's not land that we're lacking, it's the infrastructure to the land. And it's challenging. Anytime a community grows as rapidly as what we've seen in the last 15 years in Gaston County, there's growing pain for sure.
And Susie, I would say that's a great idea for a forum in the spring here for bringing in some of these other municipalities to really talk about the challenges they face with growth and how that we can learn from that. So thank you for that idea. Susie is an incoming board member of the GBA starting in January. She's already working hard for us. Mr. Marasso.
Thank you, kind sir. My goal is always to learn something new every single day. You guys just filled up my entire month of learning things new. The GBA this is just a great outlet for us to put these ideas together and then work within our elected officials, not only in Gaston, but our Gaston County. So this is going to be a great forum for all of us to get our information to our city and county leaders. Rob, I'm with you on this as far as setting off the Facebook for our elected officials and working to understand that we have a property value, and if we keep on making us neutral, we will never be able to become the county and the city that we deserve. To quote somebody, we need to be the county seat, not the toilet seat. And I think if we look at our elected officials and understanding the importance of what taxing income does, do you think we can get that message through and in turn put the infrastructure needed? Because it's either going to be a bond or it's going to be through taxes that we get done.
So let me do this.
And then, let me just say one thing. The developers, if you look at developers as bad things, as a bad group of people, then you're going to cut your community short. Invite them to the table and say, these are the things we'd like to see. Can you help bring these things to us? And the brokers and the developers can make that happen if you just voice what you want.
And I have to say, when I moved here, I was doing national energy policy, so I traveled. The only thing I needed to do was be near the airport. I chose Gaston County. When I came and saw Belmont, it reminded me of my home, which is Pinehurst. I mean, it just looked like it. I chose this county. So please don't call it a toilet city. That is rich as my, I mean, and I love it here. I will say too, and I'll show, that the elected officials are wonderful who I work with. But I know the city and county and the managers for the towns, they're so bright. When they call and they have questions, I mean, one of the things that we just recently did was for the River District in western Mecklenburg County, worked with their government affairs people and told them, we're gonna need a substation this site. We just bought 27 acres there. Not only will it house that substation, but it will house battery storage because they want plug-in outlets in all their garages for their electric vehicles. They knew they were gonna need that, and they put aside maybe some less desirable properties that they had bought, which is fine with me, to have that, and we bought that. So we can work with them if you let us work with our developers to help get that infrastructure in, and so no toilet seat.
I'm going to jump in as well, Pat, just sort of close. Just from a perspective, these are good problems to have.
Yes.
Right? There are a lot of communities that would love to have a problem talking about growth and infrastructure not meeting that challenge. So that is a problem we need to address. And we're a consumer of a lot of Martha's products and the cities and everything else. But just keep in perspective, guys. I have colleagues across the state, some that are in rural hospitals that are most likely in the next couple of years going to close. They would love to be talking about growth problems and pressure on infrastructure and things like that. So I just encourage you to sort of, yes, it's okay to be frustrated. We all are frustrated at times about things and things that are happening in our community or not happening. But I would encourage you to sort of look at the other side of that coin, that there's a lot of optimism there. The fact that we are talking about problems related to accelerated growth in our community. From a healthcare system, that's a good thing for us. I would much rather you be telling me you got too many patients you need to find out how to take care of, as opposed to you do not have enough demand to be able to keep the lights on in your building.
Yeah, and Chris is always great to bring perspective, which is critically important for the business world to have. And I kind of to Jim's questioning, sometimes we get lost in the argument of cost, and I think we should overlay that with the value proposition of things. I think back, so I live in a neighborhood that was started in the late 1800s. It has wide streets and wide sidewalks, and now the developers say, well, we can't afford that. I get that. I had this conversation with John Crosland 30 years ago around affordable housing. And I said, well, so does that mean people that don't have the income don't get the trees, don't get the sidewalks, don't get the benefit of accruing sort of the investment there? So if we're just cost, we're gonna go likely for the lowest number, and sometimes that's regrettable on the back end. Another example is the light rail, the first leg of light rail in Charlotte. It was $40 million cut out of that project because the budget wasn't met in the budget. That's a whole other story. But what happened was that was very short-sighted because now Charlotte's having to go back and retrofit that line for multiples of that money. And by the way, that line was 10 miles for $400 million. Today, nobody would blink an eye at that. But in the moment, these things are really expensive, really complicated, and I get that. We owe it to ourselves to say, all right, let's play this out though. What do we want? We want a great community. We are a community of opportunity, to Chris's point. But that doesn't mean we're always that way. It doesn't take long for communities to shift. And we just need more and more thoughtfulness as a business community to help elected officials and to help the development community, to help the hospital and help everybody involved, so that we can really look at each other in 20 years. I do start doing the math at my age, but I think in 20 years I'm going to do this. And we're proud of the decisions we made, right? Because they do play out. 20 years goes by fast. Some of you've been involved in projects or building your business, and you look back and say, thank goodness I made that tough decision, because that really played out well for me. And that's what we aim to do and guide these conversations. So I appreciate the panelists. Please give these folks a applause. Hopefully, not just Jim learned something today. No, I did. It was a great conversation. Sophia, as always, fascinating. You do a wonderful job with helping us understand the crazy dynamics. I hope you don't have some other appointment, I don't know, flat tire on your bike, you can't come next year. We hope you can, because it really does help sift through a term you used before, the noise. And there's so much noise, and I hope you all will look at different points of view and different sources of information with everything that's going on in the world, and then ask yourself, right, what do I do with that here at Gaston to seize on the opportunities we have and to really drive the sustainability of this community, because it's a great place. And to Rob's point, frankly, I know the development hasn't occurred to the level that other surrounding areas in Charlotte, but it also didn't occur poorly. So we have a chance to really learn from others, to Susie's point, which we will do. Thank you to CaroMont for the sponsorship of this entire event. Thank you again to First Horizon. And we do have one final event for the GBA. Will be here in this room on December 5th. That's a Friday, a luncheon, and this is just an opportunity to celebrate, honor some local folks who have done well for the community, and just to take a breath after a long, crazy year. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.